Hi. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mark Lasher, and I'm delighted to welcome you to 92nd Street Y. I'd like for you to join me in welcoming 21 cities for tonight's program via satellite broadcast and webcast. Albuquerque, the Bronx, Comac, Cooper City, El Paso, Evans, Fort Worth, Harrisburg, Ketchum, Kitcher, Larkspur, Long Beach, Miami, Ottawa, Providence, San Antonio, San Diego, Scarsdale, Scottsdale, Springfield, and Utica. Let's all give them a warm New York welcome. I'm here this evening in two capacities. First, as a board member of the 92nd Street Y, it is my great pleasure to welcome our moderator this evening, Matthew Bishop, the chief business writer of The Economist, a weekly magazine about international news, politics, business, finance, economics, science, technology, and culture. Tonight marks the launch of a special news series at the Y led by Matthew, The Business of Giving in the 21st Century, which brings the leading figures in philanthropy to our stage. Matthew has been named a young global leader by the World Economic Forum, has been advisor to the United Nations on microcredit, and just this week he has released a new and important work, Philanthrocapitalism, which analyzes the extraordinary power of giving in the 21st century. This book has brought him in conversation with an amazing cast of philanthropists all over the world and is attracting great attention in the philanthropic, NGO, business communities, and beyond. Afterwards, he will be signing copies of this work for us after the conversation this evening. In my second capacity, I'm also deeply honored to be here as a member and supporter and board member of the Clinton Global Initiative, CGI. President Clinton's lifetime in public service demonstrated to him that governments alone could not adequately confront the world's most pressing problems without the help of the private sector, NGOs, and other global leaders. In 2005, President Clinton established the Clinton Global Initiative to turn ideas into action and to help our world move beyond the current state of globalization to a more integrated global community of shared benefits, responsibilities, and values. By gathering world leaders from a variety of backgrounds, CGI creates a unique opportunity to channel the capacities of individuals and organizations to realize change. Since 2005, CGI members have made nearly 1,000 commitments, valued at upwards of $30 billion to impact more than 200 million lives in over 150 countries. Also, as a board member of Mount Sinai, Kathy and I ended up doing a CGI commitment where we donated quite a large sum of money to send doctors to Liberia to treat people over there for about 2 weeks. The 2008 annual meeting of CGI has just concluded this Friday and has proved a year of remarkable achievement by the members of the CGI under the leadership of President William Jefferson Clinton, the 42nd President of the United States. For me, it's always a real treat. I mean, you never, you sort of grow up hoping you could one day ever meet the President of the United States. So it's actually a real pleasure and an honor to always say, I'd like to introduce you to the 42nd President of the United States of America, William Jefferson Clinton.
Well, Mr. President, it's a great honor to welcome you this evening, and it's a great honor to be here on 92nd Street Y. And we're here to talk about philanthropy, but I think we want to start with where we are now in the world and why. I'm launching a book this week about philanthropy. You've been trying to persuade wealthy people and big business to give this week, but outside, the rest of the world has been falling apart. The financial system's been collapsing. The economy is maybe on the brink of recession. I mean, why does philanthropy matter now?
I think you can make a strong argument that it matters more than ever, because if you just look at America, 90% of the gains of the last decade have been concentrated in the top 10% of earners. Some of them have lost most of it back in the last 2 weeks, but 43% in the top 1%. And increasing inequality is quite a bad thing for a democratic society. It's a problem that most of our friends in Latin America are working to overcome. Inequality has been increasing in America since 1973, with the single exception of most of my second term, when it decreased simply because the labor markets got so tight and we got an increase in the minimum wage, and so we started having the bottom 40% grow more. In this decade, worker productivity has gone up every year, but median family income is $2,000 lower than it was the day I left office, after you adjust for inflation, after a $7,500 increase in the previous 8 years. So, and now, if you assume they made a deal this weekend on this financial rescue package, which you probably ought to talk about a little bit, and it costs, I doubt if it'll cost $750 billion, but it'll be a pretty good chunk of change. And therefore, the government may be constrained in meeting the commitments that the next president is making in this campaign. I thought the most interesting question in the debate, although I wasn't surprised neither one of them wanted to answer it, was, what will you give up if you have to cut something? I liked Senator Obama's answer, if you listen carefully, basically was, well, I'll give up last pursuing energy independence and health care reform, which is the right answer, and in my opinion. But if you look at the future, a good society operates best if you have a powerful private economy, an effective government, and a vibrant civil society, including non-governmental organizations. If the government is going to be unable to spend some of what might otherwise have been spent helping people at the margins of life who have problems through no fault of their own, or solving some of the social challenges that are evident to all, then it's going to be more important than ever that the rest of us step into the breach. And you talk about philanthrocapitalism. I think that's very important, but it's also important not to forget that millions upon millions of hours are volunteered every year, and skills are given, and goods are given by people who are not rich. And internet giving, as you saw in this most recent presidential campaign, means that people of modest means who can even give, $5 or $10 a week can overwhelm even what the wealthy will give if it's organized. So I believe that this is going to be more important than ever if there is an economic downturn, or if basically the government's just so strapped for cash that they can't do a lot of things we'd like our government to do.
Now, presumably Bill Gates, who you interviewed, I mean, he's not worried about going bust in this environment, but how worried were the other people? He's given away a
big chunk of his fortune, too, and Warren Buffett, virtually all of his.
But, I mean, were the other people, the other rich people there this week, were they worried about their capacity to give in this environment?
I didn't hear anybody who was there say they were, and we certainly had we raised $8 billion for good causes, and it'll help over 150 million people. Just what was done. A lot of health care issues for children, education issues, microcredit and other development programs. And there was also a very interesting thing. We had a lot of money committed to biomedical research, which is important because, in my opinion, we doubled biomedical research in the budget of the NIH when I was president. It hasn't gone up quite that much in this last 8 years. And in spite of the good things that have been done, I think, the most important thing the Bush administration has done that helped build goodwill around the world is put this massive amount of money into AIDS and malaria. And the president signed a bill passed by the Congress with an overwhelming bipartisan vote to triple that over the next 5 years. But there are lots of problems where there's a big underinvestment in biomedical research, and I'll just give you one. I went to 300 towns for Hillary in March, April, and May through June the 3rd. Probably 150 before that, but 300 separate towns, not events, towns. and I'd have these little meetings, and afterward people would come up and talk to me. There was hardly a meeting we had that did not have at least one parent or parents with children with autistic conditions. And Hillary, a lot of them supported her because she put out this big comprehensive plan and had been on the autism caucus. But we tripled the number of kids being born with autistic conditions in the last 15 years, and no one can tell you why. There are a lot of people who have opinions, but there's no definitive research. It's an intolerable situation. That's just one example. So that's why I think that at least people will continue to give if they have the means to do so, or if they're of modest means, if they're given a way to do so effectively.
A lot of the social entrepreneurs that were there at the CGI seem quite worried that their funding that they get from government would be cut. I mean, so why don't we talk a bit about how bad you think it's going to get, and whether you think this package actually is going to work, and whether and whether there's actually going to be big cuts for money going to social entrepreneurs and other charities.
The answer to those two questions, how bad will it get and whether it'll work, or I don't know. But here's what I think. First, I think a rescue package should pass. I feel very strongly. Second, I think that it's so wildly unpopular in America today because people believe that they've labored under enormous debt. Most of them have. Let me just back up and say, I don't have any data for the last 2 years, but in the first half of this decade, 40% plus of America's growth was in housing, and almost all the rest was fueled by consumer spending, which led to maxed out credit cards and second mortgages on homes. So over 2/3 of the American people are having trouble paying their bills every month. One reason I believe Senator Obama will be elected in November. People are having a hard time getting from here to there. So there's a lot of angst among people saying, well, nobody's helped me out, and even old George down the street should have known better than to take out the home mortgage. And no one is explaining what this is about. But I think it should pass and must pass because of the genuine risk, if we do nothing, of a continuing collapse of confidence in the essential pillars of finance in America and the drying up of credit. This is not about saving Wall Street. Wall Street, as we know it, is gone. You know, there are no freestanding investment banks anymore after Goldman and Morgan Stanley decided to go under the Bank Holding Company Act. But I live in Westchester County now. It's one of the wealthiest counties in America. And I promise you, everybody that lives there that's got more than $100,000 in a single bank is trying to figure out how to get it into Treasury notes. If we all do that, who is going to provide financing for new cars? Who's going to provide financing for installment purchases through Sears for a refrigerator or something? That's the real problem. Nobody's explained to ordinary people that this is about how the basic financial system in America works. And every bank is only required to be capitalized at about 10% of its loan volume. And, you know, that's more than enough if anybody's got a lick of confidence. But if nobody can extend any credit for anything, then we could be in real trouble. So do I think it should pass? Yes, I do. I think it's important that it have three components. One, absolute 100% total transparency. Two, regular reports and vigorous oversight by Congress. And three, in my opinion, there should be a moratorium on these home mortgage foreclosures for a couple of months. And there should be a system in this financial package required to review every one of these mortgages and every one that can be rewritten so that the mortgage payment can be made by someone who took out a mortgage in good faith should be done. Why? The average home mortgage foreclosure costs the American economy $225,000. The average home mortgage foreclosure in America in a big city where the cost of living is high can be as high as $350,000. If you can redo a mortgage for a $50,000 or $100,000 loss, it's crazy not to do it. And when we did this in the Depression, the taxpayers actually wound up making money on the deal. And if this is managed properly, I think it is highly likely that the taxpayers won't lose any money here. And you can do that in one of two ways. You can require an equity position in any institution that you give money to, which can be bought back within a certain amount of time simply by paying the money back. Or you can do like the AIG deal, where you take an ownership position, but it's an alternative loan. In that case, at quite a high interest rate, 11%. But you could do it at a lower interest rate, just maybe 1 point above what you normally would be. And I think the taxpayers would get virtually all of their money back, could even make a little money, and it would stabilize the system in a way that would enable ordinary people to get legitimate credit for legitimate things where they're not going into too much debt. I think over the long run, or even the medium term, the only way to get beyond that, beyond kind of getting back to ground zero, is for America to have an investment strategy that actually generates jobs and raises incomes again. And the only clear candidate for that is a serious commitment to more clean energy, more energy efficiency, moving toward energy independence and fighting global warming. It's a lay down. And if we had done that at the beginning of this decade, then you wouldn't have had all those huge numbers of dollars being fit in that narrow housing hole and then leading to more and more, esoteric instruments and greater debt with less collateral. So that's how I think it can work and should work. And if it happens, I think we'll get out of this. It'll probably take about a year if we do everything right. And if we don't do everything right, it'll probably take about 2 years. But this is a very potentially resilient economy because worker productivity has gone through the roof. The labor and capital markets are flexible. Innovation is still alive and well, but we've overconsumed, underinvested, taken too much risk, and the government has led the way by telling us we could have everything for nothing and promising us a bunch of tax cuts and running the, if they just stayed with the budget I left them. We paid $600 billion down on the national debt. We would have the money to deal with this. We would have the money to deal with the energy investments we need. We'd have the money to do the health transition we need. But we didn't do that. So we've all been out here acting like you can get something for nothing. Last week it got so bad that the Chinese central bank told the local banks not to buy American paper anymore. And they don't want us to go broke because we buy all their stuff. And even they're scared. So we are going to have to move back to greater prudence, greater capital requirements. We're going to have to keep reserves. We're going to have to manage debt. But right now, we got to save the system and then start real growth again.
But it does look like the next year or two, the government budget is going to be more constrained than it's been for a long time. I
don't see any way to avoid having a bigger deficit next year if this rescue package is passed. They may give it out in segments, maybe say $250 billion or whatever. But it'll have to be accounted for in some way on the government books. And it should be. We should stop playing like this stuff is not happening.
So how do we persuade the wealthy to come forward and step up to the plate and take up the burden of all these organizations that are going to be struggling for funds and to continue with the commitments that are out there in the world? So I was talking to Bill Gates for the book, and he said, about 15-20% of the people who could be giving on a big, effective scale are actually doing so at the moment. So there's still 80% of the super rich. Yeah. The middle class and lower, and interestingly enough, even lower middle income people, a higher percentage of them are giving about what they could than the wealthiest Americans. What I try to demonstrate is, number one, that if you do this, it can be effective. You can make a difference. Number two, there are some things that the non-governmental community can do more effectively and far less expensively than the government can. So I think there'll be more partnerships, more blurring of the lines, if you will, in this area. Everywhere I work, we work in cooperation with the governments. In all the countries in which we're in, our foundation, either with AIDS or malaria programs or economic development programs or climate change programs, we're all in more than 40 countries now, and soon be in far more than that. And we work in cooperation with the government. We also work with American programs there. But to give you an example, it cost the federal government probably $300,000 to stand up an AIDS director in another country. By the time you pay the salary, the housing allowance, the car, then you've got to have, because it's America, if there's any kind of question, you've got to have security and all that.
we can do that for probably $70,000, $80,000. So it's good when we work together. So I think you just have to tell people that, number one, you can make a difference. Number two, it's cost effective. And then I think the third thing you have to tell them is it's in their own self-interest, because if they want to live in America and continue to do well, we need a world with more partners and fewer adversaries. And finally, I make the argument that you ought to do it because you'll be happier than if you don't. I mean, the people I know who do this work, it's among the things that mean the most to them in their lives after their family. And it's better than buying another car, better than buying another boat, better than buying another house. It's actually fun.
I know the neuroscientists have monitored the brain and the part of the brain where you get the rewards for giving, and it's the same place for sex and dancing and all sorts of other things. So it really is as good as it gets.
The older you get, the more the giving scale goes up. I think no, let me give you a serious answer. It's interesting. I think young people may get this even more. You know, last year we had our first, what we called CGI Youth, the Global Initiative University. We did it at Tulane. We had hundreds of young people come. They all made their commitments. None of them had a lot of money. But collectively, they're doing things that are worth a lot of money. And they were from the United States and 15 other countries. We're going to do another one at the University of Texas this year. And I find that younger people get this. And, you know, I just think we need more publicity for the people that are doing it and showing that you really do get something in return here. It's immensely rewarding. I mean, if you've reached a point in your life and you've got all you need, why do you need the rest? Especially if you can take care of your kids. If you know, your children are going to be able to do whatever they want to do with life. You should do something. But as I said, I find some of the most fulfilled people with giving some of the most important gifts are people who aren't wealthy. And I think that it's very important to go after, it's like why did Willie Sutton rob banks? You go where the money is. We should both go after, solicit more help and proselytize to really wealthy people. But we also ought to make more user-friendly all the avenues for people who aren't really wealthy to give. I'll give you an example. When former President Bush and I announced at this last CGI we're going to try to raise some money for people in the Texas area, you know, because here in New York we've been really obsessed with the financial crisis, as we should be, and because we know that the hurricane, that Gustav and Ike were not as bad as Katrina, a lot of people aren't paying attention to just how bad it was for the narrower strip in Galveston up to Houston. And there are a lot of real problems there. So I read in Forbes back in August about this college professor who had made, you know, a decent income, but certainly wasn't wealthy, who started a website for people like him called modestneeds.com. And he just lets the people write him, he vets the request, and then he puts it up on his website. So somebody says, you know, I work at a job without health insurance, my child was in a car wreck, I need to continue to go on with some sort of therapy, it costs $100 a month. I'm just making this up. And then someone in this audience and go on the website, go through however many cases are there, and pick somebody to help. You choose the person, they tell you back, and the average gift, I think, is about up to $500 now, but it started much lower than that, and you can give less than that. Somebody needs $100 a month, you can give them $25, and people pool their gifts, and it's all designed to deal with an often overlooked group of Americans whose incomes are too high for them to get Medicaid, food stamps, you know, and a lot of other support systems. but they don't have any health insurance. They don't have other insurance of any kind, and they're one financial crisis away from total bankruptcy. And with just a little bit of money, they can get over the troubled waters they're in. So there are all these things that are happening that I hope will change everybody's attitude and make people believe that some form of citizen activism is a part of being a good citizen in the 21st century. It's not enough to work, pay your taxes, take care of your family, vote, and be an informed voter. Those are normally the definitions we have of good citizenship. You also ought to do some of this.
Well, even Al Gore's getting into that with the civil disobedience movement.
I told him he made me want to get on a tie-dyed shirt and grow my hair again. It was great. But if you think about it, it's really true. And in spite of the fact that we may be at a very small percentage of the really wealthy people, let's look at the flip side here. There are more than 1 million foundations in America today that give their money away for charitable purposes, in addition to about 360,000 various religious groups that do. Just 1 million private foundations. More than half of them have been established in this decade. So the trend is hopeful, I think.
Now, we talked a bit about the motivation for giving, and one of the things that, as we researched the book, we found was just an extraordinary range of motives. And someone like Bill Gates grew up in a home where philanthropy was expected, and he expected to become a philanthropist as he got older. George Soros had a midlife crisis and decided work wasn't worth doing unless he had a purpose. The Jewish tradition of philanthropy is sort of profound and religiously motivated. I mean, what happened to you? How did you find yourself becoming a philanthropist? Was it something you expected to do after you were president?
Well, first of all, I've always been interested in people and problems and opportunities. I mean, I got into politics because it's the only thing I could ever figure out to do that would be endlessly fascinating. It's like an onion that you can never peel all the layers off of. And when my political life was over, I felt two things. I felt, first of all, that even though I had done my best as president and as a governor before that, and I was proud of my public service, there's a lot of getting as well as a lot of giving in politics. You always have to get votes. You have to get contributions. You have to get people to support you. And I had the most fortunate of lives. And I feel if you have the knowledge that I have, the experience I have, the understanding about how to solve problems that you get because other people gave it to you. That is, every time I got elected to something and got to serve, it was an enormous gift. People were giving me an opportunity to keep learning. And I think it's, for someone like me, just inexcusable not to try to give it back for the rest of your life when you don't need anything. You don't need anything. You don't really want anything else except just to be useful. And since I now have, more free time than 90-something% of the American people, and I've been able to, I'm busier than I ever was, but I fill it with this kind of stuff. And I take enough time off to, make enough money to pay my bills, and I'd like to save enough so Hillary and my daughter can do whatever they want to do for the rest of their lives, if they want to do some sort of public service or something that doesn't pay a lot of money. But I think that, I did it because I like it. I find it endlessly fascinating, solving all these problems or failing to solve them. And because I think I would be a real schmuck if I didn't do it. It would be like unconscionable. And because it's fun. I'm telling you, it's the most fun I ever had in my life. Everybody who does it seriously. Bill Gates is happier now than he was when he was making all that money at Microsoft. I'm telling you, it's just fun. It's a good thing to do.
Well, the interesting thing is, as I've been writing this book with Michael Green, people have been saying to us, well, you're not cynical enough about this. They're rich people. They're giving money away. They must have some ulterior motive. Why aren't you being more cynical? And I've heard the same said about the CGI. They're saying, well, people are standing up there and making pledges, but we don't really know why they're doing it. Are they really motivated to do good? I mean, what do we do about that cynicism? And are you confident that the people that are coming to your event are actually doing what they say they're going to do?
Well, let me just say this. We've had, before this CGI started, we had about 1,000 commitments, and many of them are multi-year commitments. 239, going back to 2005, had been completely fulfilled. So what we did was to actually illustrate some of those that have been completed at CGI so people could go around and see it, demonstrated. Here's what they said they do. Here's what they did. Here's what the consequences are. There may be some people who don't fulfill them. I really think that the only people who won't fulfill the commitments they've made, by and large, are people who don't ever care if they get to come back again.
Would you tell a wonderful story in the book about the person, your old friend, who you wouldn't allow to come back? I
did have a friend and a totally generous person who gives a lot of money to his church and gives a lot of money away, but didn't make a commitment because he basically was more interested in politics than this. It's really interesting. A lot of my biggest donors to my foundation, I have no independent source of wealth, so I have to raise all the money for all the stuff I do around the world. And a lot of my biggest donors are people who were not involved with me in my political life. But this guy was, and so he called me on the second year and said he wanted to come back. And I said, you can't come. And I said, why? I said, because you didn't make a commitment that you are at least beginning to fulfill. And he said, but I'm your friend. I said, I know you are. I'll be glad to take you to dinner anytime, but you can't come to my meeting because otherwise I'll have no credibility. And every year, I think we got down to only 5 people last year who came who didn't make a commitment. Now, we don't require that obviously of the heads of state and heads of government, the participants in the plenary, our panelists, and then we actually pay the way of non-governmental leaders who represent poor people to come, because that's the whole purpose of being there, to bring all different kinds of people together. And sometimes I think the people just meeting each other in the hallway and talking may be the most valuable part of this. But if you're a paid participant, you got to make a commitment, and you have to be on the way to fulfilling it, or we don't ask you back. And we do keep score. And let me just say this: a lot of this stuff is hard. And what's impressed me is that how many people have called back and said, we have a full. We realized after the first year we had to have a full-time commitments office. And we had a lot of people saying, I want to do something, but I don't know what I want to do. So we bring them together with other people. We help them make the commitment. Then we help them fulfill the commitment if they're having difficulties. And so this year we had, I think, 245 commitments at this CGI, or 250, something like that. But there'll be more. There are always people who come and learn, and then they want to go home and cogitate about it, and then they'll get back in touch with us. We'll get back in touch with them and give them every opportunity to do it, and then there'll be more commitments. And that'll go on for 3 or 4 months. Then starting early next year, we will start working with the people we know want to come next year, so that an enormous number of those commitments will have been fleshed out and formed before they even show up. So we try not to jimmy the numbers and not to give anybody a pass, because the whole purpose of this is to have a process with integrity.
Now, the other line of criticism that I've heard quite a lot is, you're working too closely with big business. And your former Labour Secretary, Robert Reich, I think, has articulated the criticism best in his book, Super Capitalism. He makes 2 points. One is that essentially you're congratulating and honouring companies like Walmart, for basically doing something that makes them a profit. So why are they being honoured? And secondly, that maybe by working with big business rather than pursuing political action to control them, big business becomes too powerful. And how do you react to those criticisms?
Well, first of all, if you look at my record, I'm the last guy that raised taxes on corporations with incomes of over $10 million. Because I'm a fiscal conservative, I wanted to balance the budget, and I did. And I didn't lie to people. You can't have a government you're not willing to pay for. You have to run deficits in times of slow economic terms. There's no alternative to this, for example, this rescue package. But I would hope the American people would sense that. I wish that the other night in the debate, both candidates said the first thing I want to give up is further tax cuts for people above X. And I'm offended that we went to war and put our young men and women in harm's way, and I got 5 tax cuts and was told to go out and shop after 9/11. That offended me. Somebody should have said to me, Bill Clinton, you're making more money than 99+% of the American people, and we're sending these kids out to war, whether you agree with one or not, and I disagreed with Iraq and agreed with Afghanistan. And we got to get the money from somewhere. America had never before cut taxes in wartime, not one time. It never has happened before. And it's one of the reasons we're in the fix we're in today. So I'm conservative, and I don't pretend that you can get something for nothing. You can get it for nothing today if you pay even more tomorrow. That's what taking a loan out is. But, and by the way, we tried to fix some of the structural problems at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and were beat back in Congress. We put a report out in 2000 saying, you better watch this subprime mortgage market. It's about to get out of hand. So I think my record on that is clear. On the other hand, look at all the good that big business has done. I'll give you just one example. Coca-Cola was the first major employer in Africa to tell its employees that they should not be ashamed to be HIV positive. They all need to get tested. Not a single person would be fired if they were. We had to turn around an epidemic. They did that before governments were doing it. I think they should be applauded for that. Walmart, before a lot of other big companies were doing it, decided if they cut down on their packaging, they could take 220,000 trucks off the road. You know how many pounds, million tons of greenhouse gases that'll save? I think they should be congratulated for doing that. You really, I mean, if they use migrant illegal labor illegally, they should be investigated and fined. If they otherwise break the law, they should. They were the first major company of their size that said, we'll support national health insurance. The SEIU, the most liberal public employee union in the country, stood on the stage with a Walmart president about a year and a half ago and called for universal health care. They finally figured out that unless everybody had to do it, we weren't going to be in a tenable position in the world, because the employer community was either going to be painted as thugs for not taking care of their employees and their families, or we were going to keep spending 16% of our GDP when none of our competitors spend more than 11%, and it's all on the employment sector, which is a big problem for our international competitiveness. So if they do the right thing, why should we treat them as if they're inherently bad? I just don't agree with that. I think that there are going to be big businesses in the global economy. A lot of the businesses have higher GDPs than most of the countries I work in, and more revenues. And we should attempt to work with them to create an interdependent world of shared benefits so that they're not contributing to increasing inequality, and they are contributing to the social good. And when they do it, I think they ought to get credit for it. That's just what I think.
Now, another phenomena that we write about in the book is this phenomena of the philanthropist, the celebrity do-gooder, Angelina Jolie or Shakira, and they've been along to the CGI. And a lot of people, again, say, well, what does a celebrity know about anything much, really? I mean, is that your experience? Let me just say this.
Look, you're entitled to be cynical in a sense. Let's say a well-paid entertainer, you know, in music, or a movie star, or an athlete. Anybody that's managing their image is going to tell them they got to give some of their money away, and that they might as well be given the tax bracket they're in and all that. But none of them are in a 100% tax bracket. Therefore, they are giving something. So you're entitled to be cynical there. But let's just take Shakira. She's a young Colombian woman who loves her country, who doesn't want it to be overrun by the narco-traffickers and the guerrillas that support them, and she invests money in some of the poorest areas to try to improve health care and other things, and we work with her there, hoping that these kids will have a better chance. More of them will have a chance that she had to live their dreams, knowing most of them can't be singers, and that they will be building the fabric of a more legal, decent, just society. I'll give you another example. One of the participants in this year's CGI, the actress, Julia Ormond, she is the UN advocate against slavery. There are 27 million people on earth forced into bondage, working for nothing, subject to physical abuse, sexual abuse, virtual imprisonment, all over the world. I doubt if anybody in this room knows more about that than she does. She didn't agree to check her brain at the door just because she was in a few movies. And if someone decided, Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie have made a serious long-term commitment to rebuilding the lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans. I'm not sure that the federal government has made as consistent a commitment as they have. And they didn't come this year to CGI, but when they heard that I was putting together this Haiti relief package, with the help, I might add, of Wycliffe Jean and Matt Damon, they called and said, we'll pay for 12 schools to be rebuilt, and we want you to make them green like you're trying to do in New Orleans. Now, why shouldn't they do it? If they should be no more barred from doing this than other philanthropists, and a lot of them know it. I'll give you another example. When I started my climate change project, and I wanted to organize massive conservation building retrofits in big cities, I didn't have any money to get started. Rupert Murdoch and Barbara Streisand gave me my first $1.5 million.
That's a combination.
It's the only thing they ever agreed in their life. Now, she happens to know a lot about this. She may have the voice of the generation, but she's also got a very high IQ. Should she be disabled from being an effective citizen? I don't think so. So I don't have a lot. I think anybody that, if celebrity can be used for good, and that's the message you're sending to kids, that what you ought to do with your fame and your talents, that's a pretty good message. I'd rather have that than a lot of the messages that go out.
Now, what got you most excited from what you heard in the last few days about these great ideas for fixing problems out in the world? What really got you buzzing this week?
Two things. I began to believe that there is a lot more sophistication now than there was about how to make all of our efforts work better and be more effective. I'll just give you one example. On the morning I came down here to start my CGI stuff at night, George Soros hosted a meeting and asked me to come by and speak with the president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. Let me back up. Liberia has between 3 and 4 million people. It was subject to 14 years of a hideous civil war. 2 years ago, when I agreed to go there and start working on their AIDS problems, it was obvious that they had lots of other problems that in some ways were more pressing. At night in Monrovia, only 20% of the lights were on. There was essentially no electricity in the country. The students at the university were strapped for teachers and materials, and they were very impressive. I met with a lot of them. And it was just a country that had been wrecked for 14 years by selfish politicians and greedy people supporting them, and a lot of things that happened, horrible things. But they elected a woman president who had been a World Bank official and had been a virtual been in political exile and a virtual political prisoner, and she ran against all the old guard, ran the only authentic sports hero in the country who was a soccer player who looked like a movie star against her, and she beat him like a yard dog, which goes back to your celebrity thing. People are capable of discerning whether celebrity is being used for good or not. And she deserves to be helped. So in only 2 years, they took their per capita income from under $300 a year to $400 a year. That may seem like nothing to you, but it's all the money in the world to a lot of people. Rwanda, one of the best governed countries in Africa, went from a per capita income in 1998, when I went there as president, of under $300 a year, about $268 a year, to $1,000 this year. They've nearly quadrupled their income in a decade. This makes a difference. So what Soros did was to get everybody around the table, including Bob Johnson, who made his fortune in black entertainment television, and whom I introduced to Liberia. He went out and raised a $30 million development fund there, and the fund's building a hotel, and he decided to build another one. And all the people who do all the other kinds of work there, the educating children, working to empower young women, all the things that are being done, they sat around the table and made a commitment to work through the government's development plan to coordinate everything we all do together so we won't be falling all over each other, and our efforts will be amplified. That may sound like not a very sexy topic, but if you do this work all the time, it's huge. Really, really big. The other thing that I thought was important, because I do so much work in health, is that for many years, people understandably wanted to get more medicine for AIDS and malaria, let's say. And I did a lot of work on that. We've got the cost way down now. We've got the delivery systems down. And people are still dying like flies because there are no health systems out there. So now there's a real understanding that we're going to have to build out affordable national health networks in all these countries. And we really can do this without much more government money if we do it right. And it's a priority that Bill Gates has helped me do that in some places and help us to evaluate the most cost-effective way to do that. And then the other thing that really struck me was how hungry people are now to do something they can afford to do right now to cut their energy bills, put people to work, and do something about global warming. And the economic opportunities there are truly staggering, not just in the rich countries, but in the poor countries. We have many people from developing countries now who finally get it, that they are being killed the most by like high oil prices. A lot of poor countries. There are 53 countries in the world that are low-income countries that have to import more than 70% of their energy requirements. So you can readily see that these rising prices have wiped out the impact of all their foreign aid, the aid increases the last few years, and the impact of the debt relief. So we now have the two leaders in the Caribbean, where I started my AIDS work, came up to me because they'd read a speech I gave in Las Vegas about this, that any Caribbean island could be made completely energy independent, and it would be incredibly liberating. And they asked me if I'd come meet with all of them and get an energy profile done of every single island, what the wind capacity is, what the solar capacity is, what the efficiency improvement possibilities are, and come up with a plan, and then figure out how we could at least have a strategy for every one of these islands to pursue this. So those were the three things that were kind of different about this meeting that I thought were great. And there were, always very moving personal stories. We got more and more kids involved now, including a 7-year-old girl that wanted to help this child health program, so she started knitting little caps for babies that she wants to sell and give money to the program for. Because I always think that's good. I think getting people involved in this as early as possible can make a huge difference.
Now, you mentioned Bill Gates, and you can imagine the one good thing that has happened, I guess, under foreign policy, under this administration, has been Bill Gates' work and other philanthropists in global health. And without that, I mean, the record would have been absolutely unredeemable, I think, as a foreign policy. But at least there was this one good thing that happened. Now, you didn't have a Bill Gates during your presidency. He didn't really get going as a philanthropist till towards the end of that. Ted Turner came in and paid the UN bills for a while. But as a president now, and you had both candidates speaking at the CGI, I mean, is there how would you advise the new president to think about his relationship with philanthropists like Bill Gates? Are they making the most of the opportunity? What could happen?
Well, first, the first person who sort of educated me about the almost unlimited potential of this was Hillary. She got me to have a conference in 1999 on philanthropy at the White House. And Bill Gates had just sort of really gotten his teeth into this and said, he made a statement I'll never forget. He said, I'm afraid it's going to be harder to give this money away than it was to make it. But that's what you want. The Gates Foundation is exceedingly well run, even though it's very big. That is, they really monitor the impact of their grants, and they hold the high performance standards on everything but all the research they're doing, like for an AIDS vaccine or a microbial gel. Gates knows that it's no different. If you fund basic research, you have to be prepared to fail over and over and over again, and that he's the only foundation in the world that probably has the money to keep failing over and over and over again, but adding to the stock of knowledge until finally we get a breakthrough, either funded by his foundation or by the NIH or somebody else. But I think, let me back up and say, what he has done and what I've been able to do, we do in partnership very often with the American government programs in AIDS and malaria. And they did that irrespective of Bill Gates and me. And I think that President Bush and the Republicans in Congress, for whatever reasons, deserve a heck of a lot of credit for, we were paying probably, a huge percentage of the world's expenditures on AIDS in my second term, but it was a pittance of the money that the Republicans finally decided to give the president. The cynics say, well, they had to be liberal about something. But I really don't care. All I know is that there are there are about 2.8 million more people getting AIDS medicine than there were when I started my foundation work. And over 1 million of those are under the contracts that I negotiated to cut the prices. And over 1 million are from direct payments from the Bush administration and the Congress. And now they're doing the same thing in malaria, and it's really, really good. Now, the next president, in my opinion, should instruct. It's interesting because that's the first question Barack Obama asked me when we were meeting in Harlem. He asked it in a different way. He said, I know what you're doing now, and I know that we have to do more with what the foreign policy people called soft power. That is what we do through diplomacy and through aid programs. But he said, are we organized as we should be to do that? How should we organize it? He said, if I win this race, how should we set it up? And the answer to that is that the director of the Agency for International Development and the National Security Advisor and the people in commerce responsible for our investment policies and the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, they ought to have a plan that deals with attracting investment, private investment, and it deals with having the government work with and through people like the Gates Foundation, my foundation, and many that are much smaller, whenever you can get the same thing done for less money because you can simply save more lives. I'll just give you an example, and this is not a criticism of the Bush administration. This was true when I was there and when every other president to this date has been there. Half of the money that the Congress appropriates for foreign assistance never leaves the shores of the United States. And it's not that much different in other countries. By the time you pay the salaries for all the people that work here and then have all these consulting contracts and planning and all that. And a lot of it is good, but you wouldn't have to do it if you could do a lot of it through non-governmental groups that are on the ground that have a proven track record. And again, I will say, if you look at the budget problems we're going to be facing next time, for the next year or so, if the next president wants to affect as many lives and can't raise the budget, let's say, of AID, then you got to appoint a real social entrepreneur to run AID who understands how to make the money go further by working in partnership with others. The other thing you can do is give more money to these multilateral groups. For example, there's an organization called UNITAID, financed largely but not entirely by a tiny airline tax that the French impose on every international flight out of France. It's a small tax, but it adds up to a lot of money. And then about 19 other countries kick in a little money. And they basically use the money to buy medicine for the diseases of the poor. So UNITAID asked my foundation to take care of the children's AIDS medicine. And we were able to cut the cost from $600 a year down to $60 a year for generic medicine just by having volume and guaranteed payment and better productivity along the distribution chain. And to handle the so-called second-line AIDS drugs, about 10% of the people who have AIDS will be at a stage when the first medication no longer works, and to stay alive they have to have the second-line drugs. And because the volumes are by definition much, much smaller, the price is much, much higher. So, but if we got money for the first time, so we were able to do it. So that was, in effect, government money, because that was a tax imposed in France and public funds given by other governments, that they are working through people like me in other ways too, with malaria, with tuberculosis, with neglected tropical diseases. Every bit of that money is being spent to higher impact because their delivery system is cheaper by working through us. That's the kind of thing we need to do more of.
Now, we've got a question from Michael Rayner in Somerville, New Jersey. And we've been talking a lot about international philanthropy, but I guess, as we found in the book, a lot of the American philanthrocapitalists are very keen on education as a reform area. And the question is, there appears to be a large disparity between the quality of education in poorer urban areas versus richer suburban public schools. Now, what can we do to correct this? And I guess, what's the role of philanthropy in correcting this?
Well, I think there are three things you can do. First, if you believe the school in question has a good leader, a good principal, and a committed faculty, then you can basically fill in the resource blanks. Do they have computers? Do they have the ability to have after-school programs? Do they have the ability to have summer school programs, if that's what the problem is? And, I think that's very important. Second, if you believe they're fundamentally flawed because of the governance system, if they're mired in an old system where nobody's really accountable, you can support referendum to make them directly accountable to the mayor, which makes them directly accountable to the people. That's what happened here in New York and in Chicago. And the third thing you can do that I favor is to inject some competition into the public school system by promoting the development of charter schools, which are in the public school system, so they are accountable, but they are set up under charters which allow them to avoid some of the rules and regulations of the public school system. And if the kids don't perform better than the other kids similarly situated, you should just jerk the charter. But some of these schools, like KIPP, the KIPP schools, I forget what the acronym stands for, but they're all over America. They were one of the 3 schools that got a blue ribbon designation in Arkansas this year for their school in the Mississippi Delta. And when I became president, there was only one charter school in America in Minnesota. Minnesota was the first state to authorize them. When I was governor of Arkansas, we were the second state in the country to authorize them. We got federal money for the first time. When I left office, there were 2,000 with enough funds in the pipeline for 1,000 more to have the federal government contribute to the startup of these. But you don't really have to have any federal funds, but you have to have some startup money. So those are the 3 things that I would say. I think one big mistake in the education program of the last 8 years is that there hasn't been a continuing expansion of the after-school and summer school programs. There's a lot of evidence that kids that don't learn a lot in school lose 40% of what they learn over the summer. Then you waste a month or 2 at the beginning of the next school year going back over the same stuff that happened. We have a school year that's too short. We don't have the money right now to make it a month longer for everybody. But we ought to have summer school and after-school programs that really work. And if you don't believe these charter schools can make a difference if they're well done, and let's go back to your celebrity argument, I have never seen a more effective turnaround in students than in the charter school that Andre Agassi set up in Las Vegas. In the poorest neighborhood in this city, his school was the only one that got a totally excellent rating from the state in the entire county, including the other public schools in the richest neighborhoods. It is stunning, and it shows you what you can do. if you create a unique culture with good leaders, you bring in the parents all the time, you leave it open all the time, you got the money to do it. Now, he put a lot of money into this, and it's not possible everywhere, but that would really, there are lots of options to do this. Sandy Wiles put a lot of money into an industrial academy program that creates schools within schools, small schools that teach specific skills to people that follow certain rules, and that model works. There are a lot of different models you can look in. There are lots of websites to go to, but basically you can provide resources, change governments, and provide charter school alternatives. And in each case, you got to have accountability, but they can all make a difference. The thing I think, by the way, that's wrong with No Child Left Behind is I think it did some good in the schools that were the lowest performing schools in America, because any kind of standards would help. But if you set up a system and you say, we're going to test you every year for 5 years. That's a lot of money, a lot of time. And we're going to give you federal money based on how your kids do on the test. And then you say, but you can pick the test and the passing score. That's what the law does. You invite cheating. And B, you tend to drive things down to the lowest common denominator, which means you're only going to be helping the people on the bottom, which is why so many of the teachers are frustrated. You've had 80% of the schools in this country cut back on music, on the arts, on history, on economics, and a lot of other things, trying to give these tests every 5 years. It would be enough to give these tests, let's say I believe, at let's say the 4th, 8th, and 10th grade, but they ought to be national tests with national standards. We can take the truth. And then there ought to be real efforts to make these schools work with the right kind of leadership. And I'd like to see the thing redone. I do believe it's done some good for the absolute lowest performing schools and the lowest performing students. But the opportunity cost has been great because of the time the teachers have spent teaching to the test and the resources which have been put into that taken away from other things.
Now we've had a number of questions about your old profession and what might happen in November. We'll allow one question. The question is, from Matt Riegler, why as a voter should I be worried or not be worried about Senator Obama's lack of experience, and feel free to range broadly as to how you see the race going and who's winning and so forth.
Well, I'll be shocked if he doesn't win. I think he's going to win. I think he's going to win by a pretty good percentage. That's what I think is going to happen. I think and look, it's the sort of thing that you pay your money and take your choice here. He's almost a year older than I was when I was elected, several months older. But I was a senior governor in America when I won, so I had more experience. And yet, at some level, you can't get enough experience to be president because it's a unique job. And these are unique times. Is it a risk worth taking? I certainly think so for the following reasons. Depends on who you think is right. But first, you have to define the job of the president. You promised to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, right? And fulfill the duties of the president. That's what the oath says. So it's a different job every 4 years. You got to define what the job is. I think the job is to get the country out of the ditch, restore broadly shared prosperity, and restore our standing in the world. And I don't think you can restore broadly shared prosperity unless the president takes the lead in aggressively moving this country to a clean, independent energy future and reforming health care at a minimum. There are lots of other things that need to be done in education and everything else, but those, we're not going to get there, plus cleaning up this mess. I believe that Senator Obama's positions on economics and energy and health care are superior. I also believe that, from my perspective, he would appoint better judges to the Supreme Court and have a better thing. So I like that. I think that his background, the fact that his father was Kenyan, the fact that he lived in Indonesia for a while, the fact that he lived in Hawaii, which is a unique place, as well as in Kansas, and the fact that he lived on the south side of Chicago, the fact that he made it big at Harvard and Columbia, and he's seen a lot of America, and he represents the growing diversity of America. I think all that makes it a good risk. The fact that he is really, really smart, doesn't like to fail, won't want to fail you, and has consulted, he tries to find people who know more than he does about subjects. I'll give you one thing that really impressed me. When all this stuff happened, this money stuff happened, truth is nobody knew exactly what to do, and nobody knew in the beginning how bad it would be. So he had a lot of young advisors, many of whom had worked in my administration, who were quite smart. But he also called the senior people on my economic team and called Paul Volcker, and he got everybody on the phone, and he said, I want you to explain to me where we are and what we need to do and what the right thing is to do. I don't care about what's political. Let's decide what the best thing for America is, and I'll figure out how to sell it. That's what you want a president to do in a crisis. So I believe you can make the experience argument against nearly anybody, but I believe he's right on the issues. I believe he'll quickly help us to regain much of our standing in the world. I think he's got a good understanding. If you watched that debate the other night, they both actually performed quite well. They answered the questions well. But what people wanted to know was, does Senator Obama know enough about the world and about how he's going to act and treat other countries and how he's going to do that? I thought he did really, really well. So my argument is you almost can't, unless you really think you're prepared to risk 4 more years with an economic theory that's had lots of opportunities to show us what it will do, that he should be elected, and I think he will be. That's my argument.
Now, obviously, it must be a disappointment for you that you're not going to be back in the White House, but does it...
No. It's a disappointment to me that Hillary's not going to be president, because I think she's the best candidate I ever supported. But the truth is that one of the things that all these commentators that weren't for her kept saying is, Bill Clinton can't wait to get back in the White House, and that nobody that knows me believes that. The only thing that I hated was that I love what I'm doing now. And it would, I would never, if she had been elected, or I would never have shown up unless invited. But on the other hand, I think the country's in the ditch, and if any of us has to do anything by anybody, we ought to do it. I've been honored to do several things that President Bush has asked me to do, most of which, but not all of which, have been public. Because I think if you've been a former president, doesn't matter who gets elected, if they ask you to do something, if you can do it in good conscience, you should do it. But I was not myself anxious to go back to the White House. I was anxious to see the person I felt was the best candidate elected president, because our country needs the best we can get. I think that Barack Obama is the best choice now. I think he's, for all the reasons I said and for any number of others.
The question I was going to ask after that was that, does this, you've built this career as we call you a philanthrocapitalist intermediary over the last few years, bringing people together and inspiring them to go out and do good. Do you think it's going to be easier for you to carry out that role and to provide leadership and so forth in philanthropy, and because you're not in the White House, or would it have actually been better if you'd had that, that very particular way in?
I think if I had been the spouse of the president, I would have had more influence in getting the government to pursue policies that would empower other NGOs. I think I would have been able to continue my foundation work, but I think it is unrealistic to think that I would have had as much time to devote to it as I do now. Just because, the White House, it's sort of an all-hands-on-deck deal, especially when the country's in trouble. And when somebody asks you to do something, even if you're not married to them, you just can't say no. You've got to show up. This country is going to need every gifted person, without regard to party, who is asked to do anything to serve, to do it for the next 3 or 4 or 5 years. We have got a big transformation to effect, and it's going to take all hands on deck.
So one last question. You're optimistic that maybe this economic bailout can work, but the other huge issue facing us in the next year is going to be climate change, and can we agree a successor to the Kyoto Treaty, and will America participate in it? And I know you've made that one of your big issues for your philanthropy, to get something done about climate change. Can you give us some optimism, some reason for optimism about that?
Yes, first of all, I think this will depend largely on what happens in the congressional races, and specifically in the Senate races, because this is the first time we've ever had. You got to give Senator McCain credit for one thing. He was the first Republican senator that really embraced this climate change issue when everybody else acted like it was a socialist plot to undermine free enterprise, and everybody else in his party. I mean, and by the way, in my party too, when Al Gore and I were there, the Senate voted 98-0 for a resolution against Kyoto before Al Gore got off the plane from Japan, I think. It's the only bill I ever lost before I sent it to Congress. But we've made exponential progress in our awareness of this. And McCain deserves a lot of credit because he hauled reluctant Republican senators on 2 trips, one to the northernmost settlement on planet Earth, on an island 600 miles north of Norway, where there's an outpost that monitors changes in the planet, and particularly in the polar area because of climate change. And Hillary was the only Democrat who went. They went, and then one to Point Barrow, Alaska, the northernmost community in the United States, where Eskimos broke down weeping, telling these senators that their way of life was coming to an end because of the warming of the planet. Thousands of years of life was going to come to an end. And so Obama's position is stronger because he is for what the scientists say we have to do, which is to achieve an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050. And I think Senator McCain supported the Warner substitute, which I think was 70%. But the point is, you're going to get a White House that believes we have to have a big reduction in greenhouse gases and join an international agreement. The question is, will the Republicans who don't believe this, and maybe joined by some tiny number of Democrats who might be influenced by the energy interests in their home state, will they have 41 votes to filibuster the right kind of legislation to keep us from putting a price on carbon by setting up a cap and trade system and actually implementing this to create the market incentives necessary to accelerate the move to clean energy? And my guess is that our chances of success are well over 50-50. If this can be sold as an economic opportunity instead of castor oil. And I think it's very important that all of you understand this. I mean, one of the reasons that India and China didn't want to go into the Kyoto Agreement is that they literally could not imagine how they could keep growing economically if they committed to reduce their greenhouse gases. But after China's experience with the Olympics, my foundation was invited to work in Beijing and Shanghai on building retrofits to make them more energy efficient. The largest single manufacturer of solar panels in the world is now a Chinese company. So I think that, look, everybody's just going to have to get over this. In the state of Rajasthan, where I have spent quite a bit of time in India, the state government is working with us, trying to come up with a plan to build the largest single solar generator in the world that uses big reflectors to create, in effect, solar thermal power that can be put into an electrical grid. So I think the chances are better than 50-50. But you should remember this, particularly if you're in the business of, if you care about this and you get solicited by all these committees and everything to give money, if we had 4 or 5 more really committed senators on this issue, translated means Democrats in this case, or if the Republicans in close Senate races had to promise to do this to hold on to their jobs, then we could avoid the filibuster. But I think the chances of getting the right energy legislation are quite good if we can avoid the filibuster. That's why we didn't get health care reform in '94. I think we got a good chance, if we can figure out the financing, to get health care reform now, because the small business community, I think, will be for it, where they were opposed to it before. And I think 80% plus of the doctors in America have finally decided to join the nurses and everybody else, thinking that the current system is unsustainable. I had more specific healthcare horror stories in all these hundreds of meetings I told you about than any other single thing. Now, at the end, it was equaled by the gasoline stories and you know, the other economic problems. But 45% of working age Americans reported some level of difficulty in dealing with their health care costs last year. That's a pretty stunning number. So I think we got a good chance to get them both.
Great. Well, Mr. President, I could happily sit here and talk all night, but I'm told people have to go to work in the morning, so and I'm sure you have plenty of other things to do. And I'd like to thank you for kicking off this series of talks about philanthrocapitalism and for helping launch this book and for all your leadership you give us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.